The hardest part wasn't the dress. It wasn't the makeup. It wasn't the heels. It wasn't even the moment I looked into the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at me. The hardest part was putting my hand on the front door, hearing the music on the other side, and knowing that the second I opened it, there would be no hiding. For 3 hours, I had been telling myself I could still turn around. I could take off the dress. I could wipe away the makeup. I could change back into the clothes I had arrived in. I could text my friend that something came up and go home. Nobody would ever know. But my hand was already on the door handle. And for the first time that night, I realized something that completely changed the way I thought about cross-dressing. The fear wasn't proof that I was doing something wrong. The fear was proof that I was doing something that mattered to me. I took one breath, then another. I opened the door. The music hit first, then the lights, then the voices, then the laughter. And suddenly, every doubt I had been carrying for months became 10 times louder. I stood there frozen. A few people turned toward me. One person smiled. Another looked surprised. Someone whispered something to the person beside them. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel it in my chest. For one horrible second, I thought, I can't do this. Then I remembered why I had come. Not to impress anyone. Not to prove anything. Not to become somebody else. I had come because I wanted to experience one evening without constantly fighting myself. And that was the lesson I wish someone had taught me before I ever tried cross-dressing in public. You don't become confident before you take the first step. Sometimes you take the first step while you're terrified, and confidence comes afterward. I hadn't always understood that. A few months earlier, the idea of wearing feminine clothes outside my bedroom had seemed completely impossible. In private, things felt different. I could experiment. I could try different outfits. I could stand in front of the mirror. I could practice makeup. I could laugh at myself when something went wrong. If I didn't like the way something looked, I could simply change. But the moment I imagined another person seeing me, everything changed. What if they laughed? What if someone recognized me? What if someone took a picture? What if people stared? What if someone asked questions I wasn't ready to answer? What if I suddenly hated the way I looked? The questions never stopped. And the more I tried to answer them, the more impossible everything felt. Then one Saturday afternoon, my friend Daniel called me. He was organizing a small birthday party at his apartment. Nothing huge, just friends, music, food, games, and a few people I already knew. "You're coming, right?" he asked. "Maybe." That's not an answer. "I'll see." "You always say that." I laughed. He paused for a moment. Then he said, "You know you don't have to come as anybody except yourself." That sentence stayed with me. I didn't tell him exactly what I was thinking. I wasn't ready. But that night I stood in front of my closet and stared at everything I had collected over the previous few months. A black skirt, a cream blouse, a pair of low heels, a simple necklace, a small handbag, a wig I had bought online after spending almost an hour staring at the product page because I was too nervous to click purchase. None of those things were extraordinary, but together, they represented a version of me I had been afraid to acknowledge. I pulled the blouse from the closet, then the skirt. I placed them on the bed. For several minutes, I simply stared at them. Then I changed. Slowly, carefully. I wasn't trying to look like a celebrity. I wasn't trying to create some impossible fantasy version of myself. I wanted to look believable, comfortable, natural. That became one of the most important lessons of the entire experience. When you're learning how to cross-dress, don't begin by asking, "How do I look perfect?" Ask, "How do I feel comfortable?" Those are completely different questions. Perfect is exhausting. Comfort gives you freedom. I started with the basics. The blouse fit comfortably around my shoulders. The skirt wasn't too short. The shoes were low enough that I could actually walk. The wig wasn't the most expensive one available, but it looked natural from a normal distance. I kept the makeup simple. Foundation, a little concealer, mascara, soft lipstick. Nothing dramatic. I looked into the mirror. For a few seconds, I smiled. Then I immediately started criticizing myself. My shoulders looked too broad. My jaw looked too masculine. My hands didn't look feminine. My voice certainly didn't sound feminine. I almost changed back. Then I remembered something I had learned from watching other people share their own experiences. Cross-dressing isn't a competition. There isn't a scoreboard measuring how feminine you look. You don't lose points because your shoulders are broad. You don't fail because your voice isn't high. You don't fail because you don't look like someone in a magazine. The goal isn't to erase every masculine feature. The goal is to explore an expression that feels meaningful to you. So I stopped staring at the things I disliked. I focused on the whole picture. The outfit worked. The colors worked. The makeup was subtle. I looked like someone who had made an intentional choice. And that was enough. I took several steps around my room. The heels felt strange. I practiced turning. I practiced sitting. I practiced standing. Then I practiced walking. That sounds ridiculous until you've actually tried walking in unfamiliar shoes. Suddenly, every staircase becomes a challenge. Every uneven sidewalk becomes a trap. Every doorway feels narrower. And that is another lesson nobody tells you. If you're planning to cross-dress outside for the first time, practice at home first. Not because you need to perform femininity perfectly. Because you deserve to feel physically safe and comfortable. Learn how your clothes move. Learn how your shoes feel. Make sure nothing is too tight. Make sure you can walk naturally. Make sure you can sit comfortably. Make sure your makeup won't become a disaster after an hour. And most importantly, have a backup plan. I packed a small bag with flats, makeup wipes, a jacket, and a change of clothes. I wasn't ashamed of having an escape route. I actually felt safer because I knew it was there. At 6:30, I was ready. The party started at 7. The apartment was only 15 minutes away. I stood near the front door, holding my handbag. I looked at my reflection one final time. Then I whispered, "Just get in the car." That was it. I didn't tell myself I had to conquer the world. I didn't tell myself everyone would love me. I didn't tell myself nobody would notice. I simply told myself to get in the car. 5 minutes later, I was driving. The entire journey felt like a strange dream. At every traffic light, I wondered whether someone in the next car could see me. At every red light, I considered turning around. When I reached the street, I parked farther away than necessary. I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel. 7 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 12. I could hear music from the building. People were arriving. I watched a couple walk toward the entrance, laughing together. They disappeared inside. I stayed in my car. I thought about changing. I thought about going home. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen. I typed, "Almost there." Then deleted it. Typed, "Sorry, can't make it." Deleted that too. Finally, I wrote, "I'm outside." He replied immediately, "Come up." 2 words. Come up. My heart started racing again. I opened the car door, stepped outside, closed it, and began walking. The heels made every step feel louder than it actually was. I kept my eyes forward. The building entrance seemed impossibly far away. A man walking past glanced at me. I immediately thought he was staring. Then I realized he had only looked for half a second. That taught me something important. When you're nervous, your brain exaggerates everything. A glance becomes a stare. A whisper becomes an insult. A laugh becomes something directed at you. A neutral expression becomes judgment. Fear fills in the blanks. So don't automatically believe every thought your anxiety gives you. I reached the elevator. Pressed the button. The doors opened. I stepped inside. There was a woman already standing there. She smiled politely. I smiled back. Nothing happened. No dramatic reaction. No confrontation. No disaster. Just 2 people sharing an elevator. The doors opened again. I stepped out. Then I heard the music. I reached Daniel's apartment. My hand touched the door. And that brings me back to where the story started. The hardest part was not the clothes. It was the decision to let myself be seen. I opened the door. Daniel saw me first. His eyes widened. Then he smiled. "Wow," he said. I froze. "Is that bad?" He laughed. "No. You actually look great." I didn't know what to say. "Thanks." He stepped aside. "Come in." I walked inside, and suddenly I was surrounded by people. Some I knew well, some I barely knew, a few I hadn't seen in years. The first 10 minutes were difficult. I was hyper-aware of everything. How I stood, how I walked, where I put my hands, how I laughed, how I spoke, whether my voice sounded strange, whether my outfit looked convincing. I was exhausted from monitoring myself. Then something unexpected happened. People started treating me normally. One friend asked whether I wanted something to drink. Another asked where I got the skirt. Someone complimented the necklace. One person didn't mention my appearance at all. And slowly, my brain stopped screaming. I started talking, then laughing, then eating, then participating in the conversation. At some point, I realized I had gone almost 20 minutes without thinking about how I looked. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't performing anymore. I was simply there. And I learned something that night that I wish every person exploring cross-dressing could understand. The goal isn't to spend the entire evening checking whether you look feminine enough. The goal is to eventually forget about the clothes and actually live your life. Clothing is supposed to be something you wear. It isn't supposed to become the entire identity of your evening. As the party continued, I became more comfortable. I started sitting naturally. I stopped hiding my hands. I stopped pulling at my skirt. I stopped checking my reflection every 5 minutes. I even walked into the kitchen to help prepare food. That might sound like a tiny thing. For me, it was huge. Because earlier that evening, I had been terrified to walk 10 feet from the entrance. Now I was standing in a crowded kitchen laughing with people. Nobody was analyzing every movement. Nobody was keeping score. I realized that I had spent months imagining a spotlight that wasn't actually there. Most people are busy living their own lives. They have their own worries, their own insecurities, their own problems. They aren't thinking about you nearly as much as you think they are. That doesn't mean everyone will react positively. And I don't want to pretend that negative reactions never happen. They do. Some people are judgmental. Some people don't understand. Some people may say something rude. But confidence doesn't mean believing nobody will ever judge you. Confidence means understanding that someone else's judgment doesn't automatically define you. Later that night, Daniel pulled me aside. "You seem different." I looked at him. Different how? Relaxed. I laughed. I was terrified when I walked in. "I know. You knew. You were standing outside for 15 minutes. I stared at him. "You saw me?" He laughed. "From the window." I covered my face. I wanted to leave. I figured. We stood there quietly for a moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You didn't need permission to be comfortable." That sentence hit me harder than I expected, because that had been my problem all along. I had been waiting for somebody to give me permission. Permission to wear the clothes. Permission to experiment. Permission to feel attractive. Permission to walk outside. Permission to exist in a way that didn't fit the version of me I thought everyone expected. But nobody was coming to give me that permission. I had to give it to myself. And that doesn't mean you should ignore safety or boundaries. It means you shouldn't spend your entire life waiting for universal approval before doing something harmless that makes you feel more like yourself. If you're watching this because you're curious about cross-dressing, maybe you're at the beginning of your own journey. Maybe you've bought something and hidden it. Maybe you've tried makeup when nobody was home. Maybe you've stood in front of a mirror and wondered what it would feel like to go outside. Maybe you've already gone outside and had an experience that made you more confident. Wherever you are, don't rush yourself. There is no deadline. You don't have to go from private experimentation to walking into a crowded party overnight. Start small. Learn what you actually like. Try different fabrics. Try different silhouettes. Try different colors. Notice what makes you feel comfortable rather than what you think you are supposed to like. And don't assume that feminine means uncomfortable. You don't need enormous heels. You don't need complicated makeup. You don't need an extremely short skirt. You don't need an expensive wig. You don't need a perfect body. You don't need to copy someone else's style. Find your own version. For me, that meant choosing simple clothes that fit properly. That night, I realized fit mattered much more than price. A cheap outfit that fits your body can look better than an expensive outfit that doesn't. And comfort affects confidence. When you're constantly adjusting your clothes, you're constantly thinking about your clothes. When your outfit fits properly, you can focus on everything else. I also learned that makeup should be treated as a tool, not a mask. At first, I wanted to cover every feature I considered masculine. But the more makeup I added, the less natural I felt. Eventually, I learned to emphasize instead of erase. A little foundation, a little contour, soft eye makeup, a lip color that suited the outfit. That's all I needed. The goal wasn't to create another face. It was to bring out the face I already had. Hair was another learning experience. The first wig I bought was terrible. It looked shiny. The hairline was obvious. It didn't sit correctly. I thought the problem was me. It wasn't. The wig was simply a bad choice. So I learned about realistic hairlines, proper sizing, styling, and natural colors. Again, I stopped chasing perfection. I started chasing believable comfort. The same thing happened with clothing. I learned that certain cuts worked better with my body shape. I learned how layering could change proportions. I learned that darker colors could create a cleaner silhouette. I learned that posture mattered. But perhaps the most important thing I learned was that I didn't have to move like some imaginary version of a woman. I could simply move naturally. That realization removed so much pressure. You don't need to imitate every gesture. You don't need to force a voice. You don't need to perform exaggerated femininity. You can simply be yourself while wearing clothes that express a different side of you. That night at the party, I eventually forgot about all of those details. Around 11, someone suggested taking pictures. My first instinct was panic.
No.
Then I stopped. Why was I saying no? Because I was afraid someone might see them? Because I was afraid I wouldn't look perfect? Because I was afraid the image would make this real? I took a breath. Okay. We took one picture. Then another. I looked at the screen. I expected to hate it. Instead, I smiled. Not because I looked perfect, because I looked happy. That photograph became one of the most important pictures I had ever taken. It wasn't a transformation photo. It wasn't a before and after. It wasn't proof that I had successfully become someone else. It was proof that I had finally stopped hiding for a few hours. And that was enough. The party continued until after midnight. When I finally left, I walked through the same hallway that had terrified me earlier. But something was different. The hallway hadn't changed. The elevator hadn't changed. The street hadn't changed. I had changed. Not physically. Not magically. I simply trusted myself a little more. I reached the car,
Sat down.
removed my heels, and laughed. I couldn't believe how scared I had been. Then I realized that being scared wasn't embarrassing. I had done it anyway. That's courage, not the absence of fear. The decision to move while fear is still there. On the drive home, I thought about all the people who might be watching a story like this and wondering whether they could ever do something similar. And I wished I could speak directly to them. So, if that's you, listen carefully. You don't have to rush. You don't have to come out to everyone. You don't have to post pictures online. You don't have to go to a party. You don't have to prove anything. Your journey can stay private for as long as you need. And if you do decide to go outside dressed differently, plan it carefully. Choose a place where you feel safe. If possible, go with someone you trust. Know how you're getting home. Carry what you need. Wear shoes you can actually walk in. Keep your phone charged. Have a backup outfit. And remember that you can leave at any time. There is no failure in deciding that a particular environment isn't right for you. Leaving doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're paying attention to your boundaries. That's another part of confidence people don't talk about. Real confidence includes knowing when to say no. You don't owe strangers an explanation. You don't have to answer personal questions. You don't have to debate your identity with someone who is trying to provoke you. A simple "I'd rather not discuss that" is enough. Or simply walk away. Your safety is more important than winning an argument. And don't let social media fool you. You may see perfectly styled people with flawless makeup, amazing outfits, perfect lighting, and think, "I'll never look like that." You aren't seeing their entire journey. You aren't seeing the failed makeup attempts. You aren't seeing the uncomfortable shoes. You aren't seeing the outfits that didn't work. You aren't seeing the pictures they deleted. You aren't seeing the years of practice. Don't compare your first experiment to someone else's 100th. Comparison destroys confidence before confidence even has a chance to grow. Instead, compare yourself to who you were yesterday. Can you walk a little more comfortably? Can you choose an outfit more confidently? Can you apply makeup a little better? Can you look in the mirror without immediately criticizing yourself? Those are victories. And they count. I also discovered something surprising. The more comfortable I became with cross-dressing, the less obsessed I became with proving that I could pass. At first, passing had seemed like the ultimate goal. If nobody could tell, I thought I had succeeded. But eventually I realized that my happiness couldn't depend on strangers failing to identify me. If I walked into a room and someone knew I was cross-dressing, that didn't erase the experience. If someone noticed I was still wearing clothes I enjoyed, I was still having a good evening,
I was still being myself.
that changed everything. The question stopped being, do they think I'm a woman? It became, am I comfortable being me? That is a much healthier question. And it gives you control back. Because you can't control what strangers think. You can control whether you're prepared. You can control where you go. You can control what you wear. You can control how you respond. And you can control whether you allow one person's opinion to ruin an entire evening. A few weeks after the party, I decided to do something even harder. I went shopping. Alone. That sounds simple. It wasn't. I walked into a clothing store and immediately felt like every employee was watching me. Nobody was. Again, my brain was creating a spotlight. I picked up a blouse.
Put it back. Picked it up again.
An employee approached. Can I help you find a size? My brain froze. I said, I'm just looking. She smiled.
Sure.
Let me know. Then she walked away. That was it. No interrogation. No judgment. No dramatic scene. Just a normal retail interaction. I bought the blouse. Walking out of that store, I felt proud. Not because I had purchased clothing, because I had survived the fear in my own head. And that became a pattern. Small challenge. Small victory. More confidence. I stopped trying to jump 10 steps ahead. I focused on the next step. That is probably the biggest lesson from my entire experience. Don't ask yourself, can I live like this forever? Ask yourself, can I take the next step? Can I try this outfit? Can I practice makeup? Can I walk around my home? Can I visit a trusted friend? Can I go somewhere safe? Can I stay for 20 minutes? Can I leave if I become uncomfortable? One step, then another. That's how confidence grows. Not through one dramatic transformation. Through dozens of small moments where you prove to yourself that you can handle something you once thought was impossible. Months later, I went back to the same party. Different outfit, different hairstyle, different shoes. But more importantly, a completely different mindset. When I reached the door, I didn't freeze. I didn't sit in the car for 15 minutes. I didn't rehearse every possible reaction. I simply opened the door and walked in.
Daniel looked at me.
You didn't hesitate this time. I smiled.
No.
He laughed. You're getting used to it. I looked around the room. The same music, the same lights, the same hallway, the same door. But I was no longer the person who had been terrified of stepping through it. I had learned something that night that went far beyond clothing. Sometimes the hardest door to walk through is the one between who you think you're supposed to be and who you actually want to explore. And sometimes the biggest transformation isn't what happens in the mirror. It's what happens in your mind. The first time I walked into that party, I thought I was trying to become someone else. By the end of the night, I realized I wasn't. I was simply allowing myself to be seen in a way I had been too afraid to show before. That distinction matters. Because cross-dressing doesn't have one universal meaning. For some people, it's fashion. For others, it's self-expression. For others, it's curiosity. For some, it can be deeply connected to identity. And for others, it may simply be something they enjoy occasionally. You don't have to force yourself into a label before you're ready. You don't have to explain every feeling immediately. You can explore. You can learn. You can change your mind. You can discover something new about yourself without needing all the answers on day one. That's what I wish I had understood when I was sitting in that car outside the party. I thought I needed certainty before I could take a step. I didn't. I only needed enough courage for one door. And once I walked through it, I discovered that the world didn't end. Nobody's life changed dramatically. The party continued.
People laughed.
Music played. Food disappeared from the kitchen. Someone complained about the playlist. Someone else spilled a drink. Life went on. And I was part of it. Not hiding in the corner. Not constantly wondering whether I was allowed to be there. Just there. Living. That was the real transformation. So if you're watching this and you've been standing in front of your own metaphorical door, wondering whether you're ready, remember this. You don't have to be fearless. You don't have to look perfect. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't need anybody else's permission to explore harmless forms of self-expression. But you do need to respect yourself. Respect your boundaries. Respect your safety. And respect the fact that your journey may look completely different from somebody else's. Maybe your first step is a dress in your bedroom. Maybe it's makeup. Maybe it's a wig. Maybe it's talking to a trusted friend. Maybe it's going shopping. Maybe it's nothing public at all. Every step counts. And if one day you decide you're ready to walk through that door, don't spend the entire time worrying about whether everyone else approves.
Take a breath.
Stand tall. Make sure you're comfortable. Know where you're going. Know how you're getting home. And walk. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't becoming more confident. It's giving yourself the chance to discover that you already had more courage than you thought. I still remember my hand on that door. I remember how badly I wanted to turn around. I remember the music on the other side. I remember the first person looking at me. I remember thinking, this is it. And I remember opening the door anyway. That was the night I stopped asking whether I was allowed to express myself. It was the night I started asking a better question. What would happen if I stopped being afraid of being seen? The answer was simple. I laughed. I talked. I made memories. I learned. I became more comfortable. And most importantly, I went home feeling more honest with myself than I had felt in a very long time. The dress didn't change my life. The makeup didn't change my life. The heels didn't change my life. Walking through that door did. Because sometimes courage looks dramatic. And sometimes courage looks like a nervous person standing alone in a hallway, taking one deep breath, turning a handle, and stepping forward. That night, I finally stepped forward. And I never forgot what it taught me. You don't need to become somebody else to discover a new side of yourself. Sometimes you just need the courage to let that side come outside with you. The next morning, I woke up expecting to feel embarrassed. Instead, I felt strangely calm. For the first time in months, I didn't immediately replay every moment from the night before and search for something I had done wrong. I didn't wonder whether somebody had laughed after I walked away. I didn't wonder whether my voice had sounded strange. I didn't wonder whether people had noticed that I was nervous. I simply remembered the feeling of walking through that door. And I realized something. The door had never really been the problem. I had been the problem. Not because there was anything wrong with me, but because I had spent so much time convincing myself that I wasn't allowed to explore a side of myself that made me happy. That realization stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I became more curious. Not reckless. Not desperate to prove anything. Just curious. I started experimenting with different styles at home. Some outfits looked terrible. Some looked surprisingly good. Some made me feel confident for reasons I couldn't explain. Others made me feel like I was wearing a costume. That distinction became important. There is a huge difference between wearing something because you think it is supposed to look feminine and wearing something because it actually feels like you. I began paying attention to that feeling. I discovered that I preferred simple outfits, soft fabrics, clean colors, clothes that moved naturally. I didn't need to wear the most dramatic dress in the store. I didn't need huge heels. I didn't need heavy makeup. The more I experimented, the more I realized that subtlety made me feel more confident. And confidence changed the way I carried myself. At first, I thought confidence came from looking convincing. Eventually, I discovered the opposite. Looking comfortable made me look more confident. When I stopped constantly adjusting my clothes, I looked more natural. When I stopped checking whether my hair was perfect, I looked more relaxed. When I stopped trying to force every movement to look feminine, I started moving naturally. That was one of the biggest lessons I learned. You cannot build confidence by constantly criticizing yourself. If you're always thinking, is my face feminine enough? Are my hands feminine enough? Are my shoulders too broad? Does my voice sound right? You're never actually experiencing the moment. You're trapped inside your own head. And I had spent years living inside my own head. I didn't want to do that anymore. So I started practicing something completely different. I practiced being present. When I wore an outfit, I stopped staring at myself for an hour. I would put it on, check that everything fit properly, and then do something normal. Make coffee, read, watch television, clean my room, answer messages. The point was to teach my brain that wearing different clothes wasn't some enormous event. It was just something I was doing. That made the idea of going outside much less terrifying. A few weeks later, I received another invitation. This time, it wasn't a party. It was a small dinner. Only 6 people. I stared at the invitation for almost a minute. My first thought was yes. My second thought was absolutely not. Then I laughed at myself.
Why was I still doing this?
I had already survived the party. I had already discovered that the world didn't collapse. I had already learned how to handle my anxiety. So I accepted. But this time I wanted to do something differently. I didn't want to spend 3 hours preparing. I didn't want to change outfits 10 times. I didn't want to create some perfect appearance. I chose an outfit the night before. A simple dark green dress, low black heels, small earrings, a natural-looking hairstyle, soft makeup. That was it. I placed everything on a chair and went to bed. The next evening, I got ready in less than an hour. When I looked into the mirror, I didn't ask, do I look perfect? I asked, would I be comfortable spending 3 hours in this? The answer was yes. That was enough. I drove to the restaurant,
Parked. Took a breath.
and walked inside. No 15-minute delay. No sitting in the car. No emergency escape plan running through my head. Just one step after another. The hostess smiled. Table for 6? I gave the name. She led me toward the table. 2 friends were already there. One looked up and smiled. You look amazing. I smiled. Thank you. And then we started talking.
It was almost ordinary.
That was the beautiful part. Ordinary. I had spent so long imagining some enormous moment when everyone would stare and the entire room would know. Instead, someone asked me whether I had seen a new movie. Someone else complained about traffic. The waiter brought water. A phone rang. Someone laughed too loudly. Life continued. And I was living inside it, not hiding from it. That evening taught me another important lesson. The more you treat yourself like you are doing something shameful, the more shameful it feels. But when you treat your choices calmly, other people often take their cue from you. That doesn't mean everyone will accept everything. It simply means your own confidence affects how you experience the room. If you walk in apologizing with your body language, you may spend the entire evening feeling like an intruder. If you walk in knowing you belong wherever you have been invited, you give yourself permission to relax. I began noticing something else too. The people I trusted didn't care nearly as much about the clothing as I thought they would. They cared about whether I was happy, whether I was comfortable, whether I was enjoying myself. One friend eventually asked me privately, "Can I ask you something?"
Sure.
Why were you so scared? I thought about it. I don't know. Then I corrected myself. I think I was afraid that if people saw this side of me, they would see me differently. She nodded. Maybe they will. I looked at her. She continued. But seeing you differently isn't always the same as seeing you badly. That sentence stayed with me, because I had been treating different as if it automatically meant worse. It doesn't. People can discover something new about you and still respect you. They can be surprised and still care about you. They can ask questions without judging you. And sometimes they simply need time. That taught me not to demand that everyone understand everything immediately. I didn't understand myself immediately. Why should I expect everybody else to? So when someone had questions, I learned to answer only what I felt comfortable answering. If I wanted to explain, I explained. If I didn't, I said so. That boundary made everything easier. And this is something anyone exploring cross-dressing should remember. You don't owe your entire personal story to every curious person. You can keep parts of yourself private. You can say, it's something I enjoy. You can say, I'm experimenting with my style. You can say, I'm comfortable with it. Or you can simply say, I'd rather keep that personal. You don't need a perfect explanation. You don't need a label. You don't need to debate your existence. You just need boundaries. As my confidence grew, I also became more careful about the difference between confidence and attention. At first, receiving compliments felt incredible. Someone saying, "You look great," could make my entire night. But eventually I realized that if I depended on compliments to feel good, I was giving strangers control over my confidence. So I started complimenting myself. Not in an exaggerated way. Just honestly. I would look in the mirror and say, I like this. That sentence became surprisingly powerful. Not I look perfect. Not everyone will love this. Just I like this. Because my opinion mattered too. Then something unexpected happened. I started becoming less afraid of imperfections. A little uneven eyeliner didn't ruin the night. A strand of hair out of place didn't ruin the night. A wrinkle in the dress didn't ruin the night. Someone looking twice didn't ruin the night. I had finally learned that an imperfect experience could still be a wonderful experience. That sounds obvious. But when you're afraid of being judged, perfection can feel like protection. You think if you get everything right, nobody can criticize you. But perfection doesn't exist. And chasing it keeps you frozen. Eventually, I decided to take another step. I went to a small clothing store during the afternoon. This time, I didn't hide in the back. I walked through the racks confidently. I picked up several outfits. I looked at the sizes. I asked an employee a question. I went into the fitting room. And for the first time, I tried clothes without feeling like I had to apologize for being there. The fitting room mirror showed me something I hadn't expected. I didn't see a disguise. I saw a person experimenting. That difference was enormous. A disguise is something you use to hide. Expression is something you use to reveal. I realized that, for me, cross-dressing had slowly changed from hiding into expression. And that was when I stopped being ashamed of the word.
Crossdressing.
I used to whisper it. Now I could say it normally. There was no dramatic transformation. No lightning strike. Just repetition. The more I understood myself, the less frightening the word became. And the more I learned, the more I realized how many different experiences existed under the same umbrella. There wasn't one correct way to cross-dress. Some people loved dresses. Some preferred skirts. Some liked makeup. Some loved heels. Some preferred casual feminine clothing. Some wanted a complete transformation. Others wanted only one or two elements. Some did it privately. Some socially. Some occasionally. Some frequently. There was no single rule book. That realization removed another layer of pressure. I didn't have to become somebody else's version of feminine. I could build my own. And that is where I think many people get stuck. They see someone online who looks incredibly polished and assume that's the standard. It isn't. Social media shows finished products. Real life is messy. Real life includes bad lighting, wrong sizes, uncomfortable shoes, makeup mistakes, hair problems, awkward moments, and nervousness. If you're beginning, don't compare your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. Give yourself permission to be a beginner. One night, I decided to organize everything I had learned. I wrote down the things that made me feel confident. Comfortable clothing, proper fit, simple makeup, natural hair, shoes I could actually walk in, a trusted friend, a safe location, a charged phone, a backup plan, and most importantly, a mindset that didn't depend on perfection. Then I wrote down the things that made me anxious. Trying to look perfect, wearing clothes I couldn't move in, going somewhere unfamiliar alone, constantly checking people's reactions, comparing myself to strangers, thinking everyone was watching, reading every glance as judgment. That list was even more useful, because once I knew what triggered my anxiety, I could prepare for it. I could choose better environments. I could slow down. I could remind myself that anxiety wasn't always reality. That became my personal rule. Feel the fear.
Check the facts.
Then decide. If I felt nervous walking into a room, I would ask myself, do I have an actual reason to be unsafe? If the answer was no, I would breathe. If the answer was yes, I would leave.
Simple.
No ego. No proving anything. Safety first. That mindset eventually gave me the courage to attend another event. This one was bigger. A lot bigger. And ironically, the bigger event felt easier than the first party. Because I wasn't carrying the same fear. I arrived with a friend. We walked toward the entrance together. I looked at the crowd. For a second, my old anxiety returned. My stomach tightened. My hands felt cold. Then my friend said, "Ready?" I smiled. "Not really." She laughed. "Good enough." We walked in. And there it was again. That moment. The moment when your imagination meets reality. People looked. Some smiled. Some didn't notice. One person complimented my outfit. Another person asked where I bought the shoes. Someone else looked confused. And then everyone went back to whatever they were doing. The world didn't stop. That became almost funny to me. I had spent years imagining that walking into a room dressed differently would become the center of the universe. It wasn't. It was one tiny moment in a room full of people living their own lives. And once I understood that, I became free. I could finally enjoy myself. I danced. I laughed. I took pictures. I talked to strangers. I even forgot that I was cross-dressed for a while. That might sound strange, but it was actually the greatest compliment my own mind could give me. I wasn't constantly evaluating myself anymore. I was simply participating. At the end of the night, I stood outside with my friend. She looked at me. "Remember your first party?" I laughed. I wanted to run away. "You almost did." "I know. And now?" I looked back at the building. "Now I want to go back inside." She smiled. "That's progress." I nodded. But I knew it wasn't just progress in clothing. It was progress in self-acceptance. And that is why I tell this story. Not because everyone should go to a party dressed differently. Not because everyone should cross-dress. And definitely not because there is one correct way to live. I tell it because fear can make harmless things feel impossible. Fear can convince you that everyone is watching. Fear can tell you that one awkward moment will destroy everything. Fear can make you hide a part of yourself before you've even had the chance to understand it. And sometimes the only way to discover whether that fear is telling the truth is to take one small, carefully planned step. My first step was opening a door. Your first step might be completely different. Maybe it's buying an outfit. Maybe it's trying makeup. Maybe it's finding a style that makes you feel comfortable. Maybe it's telling one trusted person. Maybe it's simply looking in the mirror without judging yourself. Whatever it is, don't rush. Don't punish yourself for being nervous. And don't assume that confidence has to arrive first. Sometimes confidence is the reward for taking the step. I learned that on the night I walked into the party. I thought I needed to become fearless before I could walk through that door. I was wrong. I walked through it scared. And when I walked back out hours later, I was still the same person. But I was carrying something new. Evidence. Evidence that I could do difficult things. Evidence that my fears weren't always facts. Evidence that I could be seen and survive it. Evidence that I could express myself without losing myself. And once you have that evidence, fear becomes easier to challenge. The next time the door appears, you don't need to wonder whether you can open it. You've already done it once. You know your hand can reach the handle. You know your feet can move forward. You know your heart can race without stopping you. And you know that on the other side of fear, there might be something beautiful waiting. Not perfection. Not approval from everyone. Not some magical new identity. Just an experience. A memory. A lesson. Maybe even a version of yourself you had never met before. And sometimes that's enough. Because the hardest part was never the party. It was never the dress. It was never the makeup. It was never the heels.
It was never what people might say.
The hardest part was believing I deserved to walk through the door. Once I finally believed that, the door wasn't nearly as frightening. And if you're standing in front of your own door right now, remember this. You don't have to sprint through it. You don't even have to open it today. But don't let fear convince you that the door should stay closed forever. Take your time. Learn.
Prepare.
Stay safe. Find people you trust. Discover what makes you comfortable. And when you're ready, take one step, then another, and another. Because sometimes the life you're afraid to experience is waiting on the other side of one very ordinary door. And sometimes the person you're waiting to become has been standing there all along. But there was one thing I still hadn't learned. I had learned how to walk into a room. I had learned how to survive the first glance. I had learned how to choose clothes that made me comfortable. I had learned that most people weren't watching nearly as much as I imagined. But I hadn't learned how to handle the moment when someone actually did notice. That moment came unexpectedly. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I had gone to a coffee shop wearing a simple feminine outfit. Nothing dramatic. A soft blouse, a long skirt,
Flats.
a small handbag. My makeup was subtle, and my hair was styled naturally. I wasn't trying to attract attention. I just wanted to sit somewhere, drink coffee, and read. For almost 20 minutes, everything was peaceful. Then a man at the table beside me looked over. He looked again, then again. My old anxiety immediately returned. My shoulders tightened. My hands became uncomfortable. I started thinking about every possible explanation for his expression. Did he recognize me? Was he judging me? Was he about to say something? Was everyone around us noticing? Then he finally spoke. "Excuse me." I looked up. "Yes." He pointed toward my handbag. "Where did you get that?" "My sister has been looking for something similar." I almost laughed. All that fear, all those thoughts. And he was asking about the handbag. That moment taught me something I still remember. Never let your imagination punish you for something that hasn't happened. Your brain will sometimes create the worst possible explanation because it thinks it's protecting you. But fear isn't a reliable narrator. It tells stories. Facts tell you what is actually happening. Once I understood that, I started handling public situations differently. Instead of assuming what people were thinking, I waited. Instead of preparing an imaginary argument, I stayed calm. Instead of shrinking, I breathed. And that made me more confident. But confidence also taught me something else. You don't have to respond to everyone. Sometimes someone genuinely wants to know more. Sometimes someone is simply curious. And sometimes someone is being disrespectful. Learning the difference is important. If somebody asks a polite question and you feel comfortable answering, answer. If you don't want to answer, don't. If somebody crosses a boundary, leave. You don't need to turn every interaction into a lesson. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to defend yourself against every opinion. Your peace is more valuable than winning an argument. That lesson became especially important when I attended a larger gathering several months later. This time, I went alone. I almost didn't. I stood in my bedroom for nearly an hour, trying to decide whether I was ready. I had become comfortable around friends. I had become comfortable in small groups. But being completely alone in a crowded environment was different. There would be nobody beside me to make the first conversation easier. Nobody to distract me if I became nervous. Nobody to walk beside me through the entrance. It felt like the final test. Then I realized something. There was no test. Nobody had created one. I had. So I stopped treating the evening like an exam. I chose a comfortable outfit. A deep blue midi dress. Simple black flats. A lightweight jacket. Small earrings. Natural makeup. I packed my emergency kit. Phone. Wallet.
Keys.
Makeup wipes. Flats were already on my feet. I checked everything twice. Then I left. The drive was quiet. No dramatic music. No motivational speech.
Just me and my thoughts.
When I arrived, I sat in the car for maybe 30 seconds. Not 15 minutes. 30 seconds. Then I opened the door. That tiny difference made me smile. I walked toward the entrance. The first person I passed didn't react. The second didn't react. The third smiled politely. I smiled back. I entered. And suddenly, I was inside. The music was loud. The room was full. People were talking everywhere. For a moment, I felt like turning around. Then I reminded myself of something. I didn't need to impress anybody. I only needed to be present. So I walked to the nearest table and ordered a drink. The person behind the counter asked my name. I answered.
They wrote it down.
They handed me the drink. Normal. Completely normal. I found a quiet place to sit. For the first few minutes, I simply watched the room. Then someone sitting nearby asked, "Is this seat taken?" I said no. They sat down. A few minutes later, we started talking. They didn't know my story. They didn't need to. We talked about music, movies,
Food.
travel, random things. Eventually they asked, "Are you here with friends?"
I said, no.
"Just me tonight." They smiled. "That's brave." I laughed. "Actually, I'm terrified." They laughed too. And somehow admitting that made me less nervous. I wasn't pretending to be fearless. I was simply being honest. That conversation lasted almost an hour. When it ended, I realized I had spent an entire hour in public without thinking about whether I looked convincing. That was another milestone. I wasn't trying to pass some invisible test anymore. I was simply existing. And that's when I realized that confidence isn't really about appearance. Appearance can help. Good styling can help. Comfortable clothes can help. But confidence ultimately comes from believing you have the right to occupy space. Not because you're better than anyone. Not because everyone must approve. Simply because you're a human being who deserves to exist without constantly apologizing for taking up space. That understanding changed the way I approached everything. I started trying outfits based on what I genuinely liked, not what I thought would get the most attention, not what looked most feminine online, not what I thought would make people stare. I started choosing clothes that made me feel like myself. That meant some days I wore a dress, some days a skirt, some days jeans with a feminine top. Some days I didn't dress differently at all. And that flexibility made the whole experience healthier. I didn't need cross-dressing to become an obligation. It remained something I could enjoy. That distinction is important. If something you enjoy starts feeling like something you must do to prove something about yourself, step back. Ask why. You don't owe anyone a performance. You don't owe yourself perfection. You are allowed to experiment. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to change your style. You are allowed to have days when you don't feel like dressing up. Nothing about that makes your previous experiences less real. I also learned not to make every outfit a transformation. Sometimes the most powerful change is subtle. A different hairstyle, a different color, a different pair of shoes, a little makeup, a new accessory. You don't have to go from one extreme to another. In fact, starting small can make the entire process much easier. One of my favorite experiments was simply changing my hairstyle. I had always assumed the outfit mattered most, but changing the hair completely changed the way I saw myself. I tried a shoulder-length style with soft waves, then a straight style, then a shorter bob. Each created a different feeling, and I realized something interesting. The person in the mirror wasn't changing as much as my perception was changing. I was learning how presentation affects confidence. That knowledge became useful far beyond cross-dressing. Clothing affects how you carry yourself. Hair affects how you see your face. Colors affect your mood. Fit affects comfort. And comfort affects confidence. These things aren't magic. They're practical. Once you understand that, you can stop chasing unrealistic transformations and start building a style that actually works for you. I also became much better at preparing for public situations. I checked the route before leaving. I knew where I was going. I avoided isolated places late at night. I kept my phone charged. I shared my location with someone I trusted when appropriate. I carried only what I needed, and I made sure my clothes allowed me to move comfortably. Those aren't signs of fear. They're signs of preparation. Confidence, without preparation, can become carelessness. I never wanted to confuse the two. I wanted to be brave and smart at the same time. One evening, while getting ready, I looked at the mirror and remembered the person who had once sat outside a party for 15 minutes. I barely recognized that version of myself. Not because I had become a completely different person, because I had stopped letting fear make every decision. That was the real transformation. And then something happened that surprised me. Someone close to me noticed. "You seem happier." I asked, "Do I?"
Yeah. Why?
They shrugged. I don't know. You just seem more comfortable with yourself. I smiled. That was the compliment I cared about most. Not that I looked feminine. Not that I looked convincing. Not that someone couldn't tell. That I looked comfortable. Because comfort was what I had been searching for from the beginning. I had thought the journey was about clothing. It wasn't. The clothing was simply the doorway. The real journey was learning to stop treating myself like a problem that needed to be fixed. And maybe that's why walking into the party had been so difficult. I wasn't just walking into a room. I was walking into a version of myself I had spent years avoiding. The fear came from the possibility that other people might see what I had been hiding. But the unexpected truth was that once I stopped hiding from myself, other people's reactions became less powerful. That doesn't mean criticism stopped hurting. It means criticism stopped controlling me. There is a difference. If someone makes a rude comment, it can still sting. You don't have to pretend otherwise. But you can choose what you do next. You can walk away. You can find your friends. You can leave. You can remind yourself that one person's opinion is not a verdict. And if the environment becomes unsafe, you get out. No outfit is worth putting yourself in danger. No moment of confidence is worth ignoring your instincts. That is one lesson I would put above everything else. Enjoy yourself, but protect yourself. Express yourself, but respect your limits. Be confident, but stay aware. And never let the desire to prove yourself push you into a situation you're genuinely uncomfortable with. Over time, I started hearing from other people who had similar experiences. Some were just beginning. Some had been doing it for years. Some were still hiding. Some were confident in private but terrified in public. Some didn't know whether cross-dressing meant something deeper about their identity. And I noticed that almost everyone had the same fear. What will people think? My answer became simple. Some people will think nothing. Some will be curious. Some will be supportive. Some may be confused. Some may judge. You can't control the entire world, but you can control how much power you give those reactions. And you can choose your environment. If you're surrounded by people who constantly make you feel ashamed, maybe the problem isn't your expression. Maybe the environment isn't healthy for you. Find people who respect boundaries. Find communities that don't pressure you. Find friends who allow you to explore without turning your experience into entertainment. And be that person for someone else too. Because when you finally find acceptance, one of the best things you can do is offer it to another person who is still afraid. You don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes simply saying, "You're not the only one," can change someone's entire week. I learned that from other people too. Before I ever walked into that first party, I had watched countless stories from people who had taken their own first steps. Some had gone out. Some had dressed for special events. Some had simply experimented privately. Their experiences helped me understand that there wasn't something uniquely wrong with me. I was simply human, curious, nervous, trying to understand myself. And that's okay. Years later, I still remember that first night. Not because everything went perfectly. It didn't. My makeup wasn't perfect. My shoes weren't perfect. My hair wasn't perfect. I was nervous. I probably looked nervous. But I was there. And sometimes being there is the victory. We spend too much time celebrating perfect outcomes. But personal growth usually happens in imperfect moments. The first awkward attempt. The first nervous conversation. The first outfit that doesn't work. The first time you walk outside. The first time someone notices. The first time you realize you don't care as much as you thought you would. Those moments build you. So, if you're at the beginning, don't rush towards some imaginary final version of yourself. There may not be one. Your style can change. Your feelings can change. Your comfort level can change. And that's normal. You don't have to know where the journey ends. You only need to decide whether the next step feels right. For me, the next step eventually became ordinary. I could walk into a store. I could attend dinner. I could meet friends. I could sit in a cafe. I could go home. I could wake up the next morning without feeling like I had committed some terrible secret. And that freedom was worth more than any outfit. The greatest surprise was that I didn't become obsessed with dressing up. I became less obsessed with hiding. That was the real difference. I stopped living in constant fear of discovery. I stopped thinking every feminine item in my closet was evidence against me. I stopped treating my own interests like something shameful. I started treating them like information. Information about what I liked. Information about how I felt. Information about who I might be. And information doesn't have to be frightening.
You can learn from it.
You can explore it. You can decide what it means to you. One night, I stood in front of the mirror wearing an outfit that would have terrified me a year earlier. I looked at myself. Then I laughed. Not because I looked ridiculous. Because I remembered how seriously I had taken the fear. I remembered sitting in that car. I remembered gripping the steering wheel. I remembered thinking the world would change if I opened the door. But the world didn't change. I did. And that is something nobody can take away from you. Your first step may be terrifying. Your second may be easier. Your third may feel completely normal. Then one day, you'll realize you're doing something that once seemed impossible. Not because you're a different species of person, because you gave yourself enough chances to learn. That is what I want people to take away from this story. Not that everyone should walk into a party dressed differently. Not that everyone should seek attention. Not that you need to become fearless. The lesson is much simpler. Don't let fear make permanent decisions about a life you haven't explored yet. Be thoughtful. Be safe. Be patient. Be honest with yourself. And if you decide that this is something you enjoy, don't let the first awkward moment convince you that you don't belong. Everyone starts somewhere. Mine started with a hand on a door, a racing heartbeat, 1,000 doubts,
And one decision.
Open it. I did. And on the other side wasn't judgment. It wasn't the dramatic transformation. It wasn't some perfect fantasy. It was music,
Friends.
laughter, a room full of ordinary people.
And me.
Finally allowing myself to be one of them. That was the hardest part. Walking in. Everything after that became a little easier. And perhaps someday, when you're standing in front of your own door, you'll remember that.
Take the breath.
Check your surroundings. Make sure you're safe. Then, when you're ready, turn the handle. You might be surprised by what happens next. You might discover that the person you were afraid to show the world is actually the person you've been waiting to meet. The strange thing was, after all those experiences, I thought I had finally figured myself out. I thought the fear was gone. I thought I understood what cross-dressing meant to me. I thought I knew exactly how I would react if someone recognized me. Then one evening, everything changed. It started with a message. Are you free Saturday? It was from someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. I stared at the screen. Saturday was already planned. Another party. But this one was different. It wasn't a small gathering of close friends. It was an event where I knew almost nobody. And suddenly, every old doubt returned. I almost said no. Then I remembered the first party. I remembered sitting outside. I remembered thinking I would never walk through the door. And I remembered how proud I felt afterward. So I replied, yes. The message was sent before I could change my mind. For the rest of the week, I kept thinking about it. What would I wear? Would I go alone? Would I tell anyone? Would people stare? Would I feel comfortable? Would I regret it? I eventually realized that I was asking the wrong question. I kept asking whether something might go wrong. I should have been asking whether I had prepared properly.
So I prepared.
I chose my outfit several days ahead. I checked the weather. I planned transportation. I made sure my phone was charged. I told someone I trusted where I would be. I packed a small emergency bag. And I gave myself one promise. If I became genuinely uncomfortable or unsafe, I would leave. No embarrassment. No guilt. No proving anything. I would simply leave. That promise made me calmer. Because knowing you can leave gives you the courage to stay. On Saturday afternoon, I started getting ready. I didn't rush. I took my time with makeup. I chose a hairstyle that felt natural. I put on the outfit. Then I stood in front of the mirror. For a moment, I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. Not because the transformation was dramatic. Because the expression was different. The person in the mirror looked calm. That surprised me. A year earlier, I would have been staring at every detail. Now I simply looked. I smiled. Then I picked up my handbag. It was time. The drive was quiet. When I reached the location, I parked. I turned off the engine. And for a few seconds I sat there. I could hear people arriving. Cars were pulling in. Groups were walking toward the entrance. I felt that familiar pressure in my chest. Then I remembered something. The first time I walked into a party, I thought confidence meant not being afraid. Now I understood that confidence meant being afraid and knowing what to do anyway. I opened the door, stepped outside, closed it, walked toward the entrance. 1 step.
2.
3. No turning back. The door opened. Music.
Lights.
Voices.
People.
I walked inside. Nobody stopped. Nobody shouted. Nobody pointed. I found a registration table. A woman greeted me. Welcome. I smiled. Thank you. She gave me a wristband. Enjoy yourself. That was all. I walked away. And I laughed quietly to myself. All that preparation. All that anxiety. And the first interaction was simply welcome. I found a quiet corner.
Took a breath.
Then looked around. The room was filled with people who had no idea what was going on inside my head. They were talking,
Dancing.
taking pictures, ordering drinks, laughing, living. I realized that every person in that room had their own insecurities. Maybe someone hated their hair. Maybe someone was worried about their outfit. Maybe someone was nervous about meeting new people. Maybe someone was afraid of being judged. I wasn't the only person carrying invisible fears. Mine simply happened to be about something I had spent years hiding. That thought made me feel less alone. I walked toward the crowd. At first, I stood quietly. Then someone asked me where I got my dress. I answered. They complimented it. Then they walked away. Another person smiled. Then another. Nothing dramatic happened.
But I noticed something.
I was no longer measuring success by whether people noticed. I was measuring success by whether I enjoyed myself. That changed the entire evening. I danced. I talked. I laughed. I took pictures. And, at one point, someone accidentally stepped on my shoe. We both apologized. We laughed. Life continued. That tiny moment reminded me that normal life doesn't stop because you're nervous. Eventually, I met someone who seemed genuinely curious. They asked, "Can I ask you something personal?"
I paused.
Maybe. They smiled. I don't want to be rude. Okay. Is this something you do often?
I thought about it.
Sometimes. They nodded. Do you enjoy it? I smiled. Yes. They said, then that's what matters. Then the conversation moved on. No interrogation. No judgment. Just curiosity followed by respect. It was one of the healthiest interactions I had ever experienced. And it taught me something. People often take their cue from how you treat yourself. If you act as though you're ashamed, they may assume the subject is shameful. If you treat it as a normal part of your life, respectful people often follow your lead. Again, that doesn't guarantee everyone will react positively, but it changes the atmosphere. Later that night, I stepped outside for some air. The city was quiet. The music was muffled behind the doors. I looked up at the sky, and I thought about how many versions of myself had existed over the previous year. The terrified version, the curious version, the embarrassed version, the excited version, the confident version, the confused version, the happy version. They were all me. None of them needed to be destroyed. I didn't have to erase the person I used to be. I only had to allow myself to grow. That was another major realization. Personal growth isn't always becoming somebody new. Sometimes it's becoming more accepting of the person you've already been. I went back inside. The party was getting louder. Someone invited me to dance. For a second, I hesitated. Then I said yes. I danced. Not perfectly. Not like someone in a movie. Just normally. I laughed when I made a mistake. I didn't care. And that was perhaps the greatest sign of progress. I no longer believed every mistake was evidence that I didn't belong. I was simply human. That night ended around 2 a.m. I walked back to my car. I removed my heels once I was safely inside. I sat there for a moment. Then I smiled. Not because everything had been perfect, because I had been present for all of it. I hadn't spent the night hiding behind my phone. I hadn't spent the night checking mirrors. I hadn't spent the night analyzing strangers. I had actually lived. And that was the goal all along. Not to look perfect.
To live.
The following morning, I looked at the pictures. Some were great. Some were terrible. One was absolutely ridiculous. My hair was moving in the wrong direction. My expression was strange. I laughed. Then I kept it. Because it was real. That picture reminded me that confidence doesn't require perfect documentation. Sometimes the funniest picture becomes the best memory. I started thinking about how much pressure people put on themselves when they explore crossdressing. They want the perfect transformation. Perfect makeup. Perfect hair. Perfect body.
Perfect outfit.
Perfect photographs. Perfect reactions. But chasing perfection can turn something enjoyable into a stressful performance. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be comfortable enough to enjoy the moment. That became my new philosophy. Comfort before perfection. Safety before attention. Self-expression before approval. And progress before comparison. Those 4 ideas changed everything. I started choosing clothing based on comfort first. If the fabric irritated me, I didn't wear it. If the shoes hurt, I changed them. If the makeup felt too heavy, I removed some. If the hairstyle required constant adjustment, I chose something simpler. That wasn't giving up. That was learning what worked. I also stopped buying things simply because someone online said they were essential. There are no magic products that instantly make you look feminine. There is no single outfit that transforms everyone. There is no universal checklist. Your body is different. Your face is different. Your proportions are different. Your preferences are different. So, experimentation matters more than copying.
Try something.
Evaluate it. Keep what works. Change what doesn't. That's how personal style develops. And the same principle applies to confidence. You can't borrow someone else's confidence. You build your own through experience. The first public experience might be terrifying. The second might be uncomfortable. The third might be easier. Eventually, you may reach a point where you're not thinking about it at all. That's when you know you've grown. Not because everyone accepts you, because you accept yourself. That distinction became clear one day when I walked into a clothing store and saw a dress I immediately loved. It was simple, elegant, nothing outrageous. I picked it up, looked at the size, then walked toward the fitting room. A year earlier, I would have found a reason not to. Now I simply tried it on. It fit. I looked in the mirror. And for the first time, I didn't think about whether someone else would approve. I thought, this feels like me. I bought it. That dress became one of my favorites. Not because it made me look completely different, because it reminded me of how far I had come. Every time I wore it, I remembered that first door, that terrified walk, that party, that first conversation, that first photograph, that first moment when I realized I wasn't being watched as much as I imagined. The dress became a symbol, not of transformation, of courage. And then, unexpectedly, someone asked me to help them. A friend. They had been experimenting privately but were too nervous to go outside. They said, "How did you do it?" I smiled. I was terrified. They laughed. "No, seriously." "I am serious." They didn't believe me. So I told them the truth. I didn't suddenly become confident. I started small. I practiced. I prepared. I went somewhere safe. I had an exit plan. I went with someone I trusted. And I accepted that the first time might feel awkward. They asked, "What if people stare?" They might. What if someone says something? They might. What if I panic? Then leave? They looked at me. That's it. That's it. Because sometimes people think confidence means guaranteeing a perfect outcome. It doesn't. Confidence means knowing you can handle different outcomes. Maybe someone compliments you. Maybe nobody notices. Maybe someone asks a question. Maybe someone makes a rude comment. Maybe you decide you don't like the environment. The important thing is knowing you have choices. You can stay. You can respond. You can ignore. You can leave. You're not trapped. That understanding gave my friend enough courage to try. A few weeks later, they told me they had gone outside. They had walked into a small cafe. They stayed for 20 minutes. Then they went home. They said it was the longest 20 minutes of their life. I smiled. How did it feel afterward? They said, like I had done something impossible. I knew exactly what they meant. That is why small victories matter. You don't need a dramatic transformation to change your relationship with yourself. Sometimes 20 minutes is enough. Sometimes one outfit is enough. Sometimes one honest conversation is enough. Sometimes opening one door is enough. And if you fail, that doesn't erase the progress. Maybe the outfit wasn't right. Maybe the environment wasn't comfortable. Maybe you weren't ready. That's information. Use it. Don't turn one bad experience into a permanent conclusion. I had bad experiences too. There were days when I felt awkward. Days when I didn't like my appearance. Days when I regretted going out. Days when I changed back before leaving the house. And that was okay. Progress isn't a straight line. Some days you move forward. Some days you pause. Some days you step backward. What matters is that you don't use one difficult day to convince yourself that you can. Never grow. Eventually, I stopped thinking about the journey as becoming feminine. I started thinking about it as learning what made me feel authentic. That was much more meaningful. Because femininity isn't a single appearance. It's not one body type. It's not one voice. It's not one outfit. It's not one hairstyle. It's not one personality. It's a broad range of expression. And you can find your place within that range without becoming a copy of anyone else. That realization gave me freedom. I could wear something elegant one day and something casual the next. I could wear makeup or skip it. I could style my hair or leave it simple. I could be quiet or outgoing. None of those choices invalidated the others. They were simply different expressions. And that is something I hope anyone watching understands. You are allowed to experiment without having every answer. You are allowed to enjoy something without immediately assigning it a permanent meaning. You are allowed to discover yourself slowly. The world often demands labels.
Who are you?
What are you? Why do you do this? Sometimes the honest answer is, I'm still figuring it out. That's not weakness. That's honesty. And sometimes the most confident sentence you can say is, I don't know yet. I wish I had understood that earlier. I spent so much time trying to find the perfect explanation that I almost missed the actual experience. The experience was simple. I liked certain clothes. I liked certain styles. I enjoyed the feeling of presenting myself differently. I felt more confident when I was comfortable. That was enough. I didn't need to solve my entire identity in one night. And neither does anyone else. So if you're watching this because you are curious, nervous, or somewhere in the middle, take the pressure off yourself. Don't turn your first experiment into a life-changing test. Let it simply be an experiment. Try something.
See how you feel.
Learn.
Adjust.
And if you decide it's not for you, that's okay too. Nothing was wasted. You learned something about yourself. But if you discover that you genuinely enjoy it, don't let shame automatically convince you to bury that feeling.
You can be thoughtful about it.
You can keep it private. You can share it with trusted people. You can explore your style. You can build confidence gradually. You can make your own rules. And one day, you may find yourself standing in front of a door that once seemed impossible. And you'll realize something incredible. The door didn't become easier. You became stronger. You learned how to prepare. You learned how to manage fear. You learned how to protect yourself. You learned how to set boundaries. You learned how to enjoy the moment. And most importantly, you learned that being seen doesn't automatically mean being rejected. Sometimes being seen means being understood. Sometimes it means discovering who your real friends are. Sometimes it means discovering that you are much harder to break than you thought. And sometimes it simply means walking into a room, hearing the music, smiling at someone, and realizing that you belong there. Not because you look perfect. Not because everyone approves. Because you are there. And you are allowed to be. That was the lesson I carried from every party, every awkward conversation, every fitting room, every mirror, every nervous walk, and every moment when I almost turned around. The hardest part was always the beginning. The first step. The first door. The first time letting yourself be visible. But once you take that step safely and on your own terms, something changes. You stop asking, what if everyone judges me? And you start asking, what if I miss out on something wonderful because I was too afraid to try? That question changed my life. Because fear had already taken enough from me. It had taken evenings I could have enjoyed. It had taken experiences I could have remembered. It had taken confidence I could have built. I decided I wasn't giving it any more. So the next time I stood at a party entrance, I didn't wait. I opened the door, walked inside, and this time, I smiled before anyone else could. Because I finally understood. The hardest part wasn't walking into the party. The hardest part was believing I belonged on the other side. Once I believed that, everything changed. But even after all that progress, there was still one question I couldn't answer. What would happen if someone from my past saw me? Not a stranger. Not a curious person at a cafe. Not someone I would never meet again. Someone who knew me. Someone who had known me before I ever started experimenting with feminine clothes. That possibility had always been somewhere in the back of my mind. I didn't think about it every day, but it was there. And eventually it happened. I was at another gathering when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Wait, is that you? My entire body froze. I turned around. It was someone I hadn't seen in years. For a second, neither of us spoke. I could feel my old fear rushing back. This was different. This person knew me. They knew my old appearance.
They knew how I used to dress.
They knew the person I had been trying to understand. My first instinct was to run. Then I remembered everything I had learned.
Breathe.
Don't assume. Don't panic.
Wait.
The person smiled. I almost didn't recognize you. I gave a nervous laugh.
Yeah.
They looked at me for another second. Then they said, "You look happy." That was not the reaction I had expected. I had prepared myself for confusion, maybe judgment, maybe awkward questions. Instead, they noticed the one thing that mattered most. I looked happy. We started talking. At first, it was awkward. Of course it was. There were years between us. And this was new. They asked a few questions. I answered the ones I wanted to answer. When something became too personal, I said so.
They respected that.
Eventually, the conversation became normal. We talked about old memories, people we both knew, things that had happened since we last met. And for the first time, I understood something. Being recognized didn't automatically mean being exposed. Those are two different things. Someone can recognize you and still respect your privacy. Someone can know your past without owning your present. That distinction gave me another layer of confidence. I didn't have to disappear. I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to panic. I could simply say, yes, it's me. And keep living. That night, when I got home, I stood in front of the mirror again. But this time, I wasn't checking my makeup. I wasn't checking my hair. I wasn't checking my outfit. I was thinking about how much fear I had carried for so long. And I realized how much of that fear had been based on imagined reactions. I had spent years creating conversations that had never happened, arguments that had never happened, rejections that had never happened, embarrassment that had never happened. Fear had made me live through thousands of imaginary disasters. But reality had been much quieter. That became one of the most important lessons of my journey. Don't let imaginary rejection become a real prison. If someone has actually treated you badly, learn from that experience. But don't punish yourself for something that hasn't happened. Give reality a chance to surprise you. Sometimes it will. Sometimes it won't. But you deserve to know the difference. After that experience, I became even more comfortable with being visible. Not because I wanted attention. Actually, the opposite. I no longer needed to hide just because somebody might notice. I could walk into a store,
sit in a cafe,
meet friends, attend a gathering, and focus on the activity instead of constantly monitoring myself. The clothing became secondary. The experience became primary. That is when cross-dressing became much healthier for me. It stopped being a test. It stopped being a secret that controlled me. It became one part of how I express myself. And I learned that there is a huge difference between privacy and shame. Privacy is choosing who gets access to something personal. Shame is believing something about yourself is wrong. You can be private without being ashamed. That distinction gave me peace. I didn't have to tell everyone. But I also didn't have to hate myself for keeping parts of my life personal. I could choose. That choice was freedom. Over time, I became interested in helping other people who were just beginning. Not because I considered myself an expert. I wasn't. I had simply made enough mistakes to understand what fear looked like. One person asked me how to start. I told them the same thing I wish someone had told me. Start with yourself. Don't start with strangers. Don't start with social media. Don't start with trying to impress people. Start by understanding what makes you comfortable. What colors do you like? What fabrics feel good? What styles make you feel confident? Do you prefer subtle or dramatic makeup? Do you like wigs? Do you like jewelry? Do you enjoy dresses, skirts, feminine tops, or simply small changes? You don't need to answer everything immediately.
Try things.
Keep notes if it helps. Take pictures for yourself. Not for validation. For learning. Sometimes seeing an outfit in a photograph helps you understand why something works or doesn't. And don't be afraid to admit when something doesn't work. I had plenty of outfits that looked completely different in my imagination than they did in reality. That's normal. Your first attempt doesn't need to be your final style. I also learned to prioritize fit. This sounds boring compared with makeup or transformation, but it makes an enormous difference. Clothes that fit properly move naturally. Clothes that don't fit make you constantly adjust yourself. And constant adjustment makes you feel self-conscious. So take measurements. Understand sizing. Don't assume every brand uses the same measurements. If possible, try things on. And remember that bodies aren't supposed to fit perfectly into clothing charts. Clothing is made for bodies, not bodies for clothing. That mindset saved me from a lot of unnecessary frustration. I also learned that posture could change how an outfit felt. Not because I needed to imitate anyone. Simply because standing comfortably makes almost every outfit look better. Shoulders relaxed. Head up. Natural stride. No exaggerated movements. No forced performance. Just comfortable body language. That was enough. Then there was makeup. I used to think I needed complicated tutorials. I bought products I barely understood. I watched videos and tried to copy techniques designed for completely different faces. It usually ended badly. Eventually, I simplified everything. I focused on skin,
Brows. Eyes.
lips, a little definition. That's all. I learned that makeup should support your features rather than overwhelm them. And again, the goal wasn't perfection. It was confidence. Hair taught me the same lesson. A realistic hairstyle that fits your face can be more effective than an elaborate style that requires constant maintenance. And if you use a wig, take your time finding the right size and style. Don't expect the first wig you try to be perfect. I certainly didn't. But eventually I found styles that felt natural. And once my hair felt right, I noticed something interesting. I stopped thinking about it. That was the goal. The best styling is often the styling you stop noticing after a while. Because then you can focus on living. And that's what I wanted. I didn't want every outing to become a performance. I wanted to enjoy dinner. I wanted to laugh with friends. I wanted to walk through a store. I wanted to sit in a cafe. I wanted to remember the conversation instead of remembering whether my eyeliner looked even. That was the freedom I had been searching for. Then came the biggest challenge yet. A weekend trip. I would be away from home for 2 days. That meant planning outfits.
Packing.
Getting ready somewhere unfamiliar. Going out. And potentially meeting strangers. For the first time, I had to think about cross-dressing as part of a larger experience rather than a single evening. I packed carefully. One outfit for the evening. A casual option. Comfortable shoes.
Makeup.
Hair accessories. A jacket. Backup clothes. Everything fit into one bag. I looked at the suitcase and smiled. A year earlier, I would have considered this impossible. Now it was simply packing. The trip itself was surprisingly ordinary. During the day, I dressed normally. In the evening, I changed. I looked in the hotel mirror. There was a moment of hesitation. Then I smiled. I wasn't trying to escape my identity. I was simply choosing how I wanted to present myself that evening. I walked downstairs, entered the hotel restaurant, sat at a table, ordered dinner, and nobody cared. Again, that sounds anticlimactic, but that was the beauty of it. The world had become ordinary. The thing that had once felt enormous had become part of normal life. I finished dinner, walked outside, explored the area, bought a coffee, sat on a bench, watched people pass. And I realized I wasn't thinking about myself anymore. I was thinking about the city, the weather, the lights, the food, the trip. That was freedom. The next day, I met someone at the hotel who started a conversation. They complimented my jacket. We talked for several minutes. Then they left. No drama. No explanation. No secret. Just a normal conversation. I started wondering how many ordinary moments I had missed because I was too afraid to experience them. That thought was painful, but it was also motivating. I couldn't change the past. I could only change what I did next. So I started saying yes more often. Not to everything. Not recklessly, but to opportunities that felt safe and meaningful. A dinner, a gathering, a shopping trip, a coffee, a walk. Each one became another piece of evidence that I could live without constantly hiding. And eventually, the fear that had once felt enormous became manageable. It never disappeared completely. Maybe it never should. A little caution is useful. A little nervousness can keep you aware. The goal isn't to become careless. The goal is to become capable. Capable of recognizing danger. Capable of handling awkwardness. Capable of saying no. Capable of leaving. Capable of staying. Capable of enjoying yourself. That's real confidence. One night, someone asked me a question that stopped me. Do you feel like a different person when you dress this way? I thought for a long time. Then I answered, not really. They looked surprised. I continued, I feel like a different version of the same person. That was the best answer I could give, because I hadn't become someone else. I had discovered another side of myself. And maybe that's what makes personal expressions so powerful. We are not one-dimensional. People contain contradictions. Strength and softness. Confidence and insecurity. Seriousness and playfulness. Different interests. Different moods. Different expressions. We don't need to choose one version and destroy the others. We can allow ourselves complexity. That became one of the most freeing ideas in my life. I didn't have to fit into one box. I could simply be me. And that included the clothes I enjoyed wearing. As I became more comfortable, I also became more selective. I stopped dressing for reactions. I stopped choosing outfits because I thought they would make people stare. I chose them because I liked them. That difference may sound small. It wasn't. When you dress for attention, you become dependent on attention. When you dress for yourself, the experience belongs to you. That's why I stopped chasing the most dramatic transformation. I wanted authenticity. Sometimes that meant a simple outfit. Sometimes it meant something elegant. Sometimes it meant a bold color. Sometimes it meant nothing at all. And every choice was valid. Eventually, I returned to the first party location. I stood outside the building. I remembered exactly where I had parked. I remembered the elevator, the hallway, the door. I smiled. Then I realized I had come back to the place where my fear had started. I stood there for a moment. Then I opened the door. There was no party that night. The building was quiet. But in my mind, I could still hear the music. I could still see myself standing there, terrified. And I wished I could go back and tell that person one thing. You're going to be okay. Not because everything will always go perfectly. Not because everyone will accept you. Because you will learn. You will become more prepared. You will discover what makes you comfortable. You will meet people who respect you. You will learn to protect your boundaries. And most importantly, you will learn to trust yourself. That is the real destination. Not perfect femininity. Not universal approval. Self-trust. When you trust yourself, you don't need every stranger to approve. You don't need every outfit to be perfect. You don't need every experience to go smoothly. You know that whatever happens, you can make the next decision. And that is powerful. I finally understood why that first door had felt so frightening. It wasn't because the room was dangerous. It was because walking through it meant accepting that I couldn't control what happened next. And none of us can. Life is full of uncertainty. You can prepare. You can be careful. You can make smart choices. But you can't control every reaction. At some point, you have to accept uncertainty and move forward anyway. That is true for crossdressing. It's true for relationships. It's true for careers. It's true for almost everything worth doing. If you wait until there is zero possibility of embarrassment, you may wait forever. So take reasonable risks. Not reckless ones. Reasonable ones. The kind that teach you something. The kind that expand your world without putting you in unnecessary danger. And if you make a mistake, learn. If you feel uncomfortable, adjust. If someone judges you, remember that judgment isn't always truth. If someone supports you, appreciate it. If you discover something new about yourself, don't panic.
Give yourself time.
That was the biggest lesson I carried forward.
Time.
I had wanted immediate answers. I wanted to know exactly what everything meant. But self-discovery doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you learn by living. You try something, you observe how you feel. You learn. Then you try something else. Eventually, patterns appear. And those patterns tell you more than any label could. I became more comfortable saying, "This is something I enjoy." That sentence was enough. No complicated explanation. No apology. No defense.
Just a fact about myself.
And once I could say that calmly, I realized how much energy I had wasted trying to hide the fact that I enjoyed something harmless. I wished I had spent that energy learning sooner, but regret wasn't useful. So, I focused on the present. I kept exploring. I kept learning. I kept meeting people. And I kept walking through doors. Some doors led to wonderful experiences. Some led to awkward ones. Some I decided not to open. And that was okay. Because now I knew the difference between fear and instinct. Fear says, everyone will hate you. Instinct says, something about this situation isn't safe. Learn to listen to the second one. Question the first one. That distinction can protect you while still allowing you to grow. And if you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to become the most feminine person in the room. You don't have to impress strangers. You don't have to look like someone online. You don't have to explain yourself to everyone. You simply need to know why you're doing what you're doing and make choices that respect your safety and your comfort. If crossdressing brings you happiness, explore it thoughtfully. If you're still unsure, take your time. If you decide it's not for you, that's okay. The point isn't the label. The point is understanding yourself. And sometimes understanding yourself begins with something as simple as an outfit. For me, it began with a party.
A door.
A trembling hand.
And a decision.
I opened the door. I stepped inside. And I discovered that the world was much bigger than my fear had allowed me to imagine. Years later, I still remember that moment. Not because I became someone else. Because I finally stopped being afraid of meeting myself. And that was the transformation that mattered most. There was one final thing I had to learn. How to stop waiting for the perfect moment. For a long time, I thought confidence would eventually arrive like a switch being turned on. One day I would wake up and simply feel ready. Ready to go anywhere. Ready to wear anything. Ready to be seen. Ready to answer questions. Ready to stop caring what people thought. But that day never came. Instead, confidence arrived in pieces. A small piece every time I survived something that scared me. A small piece every time I chose an outfit without overthinking it. A small piece every time I looked in the mirror and didn't criticize myself. A small piece every time I walked outside. A small piece every time someone noticed, and I stayed calm. And eventually, those pieces became something bigger. Not fearlessness. Self-trust. That was the thing I had been searching for without realizing it. I didn't need to know exactly who I was going to become. I needed to trust myself enough to discover it. One afternoon, I opened my closet and realized something strange. The clothes that once felt like secrets were simply clothes. They were hanging beside everything else. There was no dramatic separation anymore. No hidden box. No frantic checking before someone entered the room. Just clothes. I picked up a blouse,
Put it on.
looked in the mirror, and went about my day. That ordinary moment felt more powerful than any party.
Because it showed me how much had changed.
I no longer needed a special occasion to express myself. And I no longer needed to express myself every day either. I had choice. That was freedom. Choice without fear. Choice without pressure. Choice without needing anyone else to tell me what the choice meant. I started understanding that self-expression doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes the most meaningful moments happen when nobody else is watching. A quiet evening at home, trying a new hairstyle, learning a new makeup technique, finding an outfit that fits perfectly, standing in front of the mirror and smiling. Those moments matter too. In fact, they may be the foundation of everything else, because public confidence starts with private acceptance. If you hate everything you see in the mirror, no crowd will fix that. If you're comfortable with yourself, a crowd becomes much less powerful. That was why I stopped chasing the perfect transformation. I focused on the relationship I had with myself. And slowly, that relationship became kinder. I stopped using words like ridiculous when something didn't work. I started saying, that style isn't for me.
That small change in language mattered.
Instead of attacking myself, I evaluated the outfit. Instead of saying, I look terrible, I said, this color doesn't suit me. Instead of saying, I'll never look good, I said, I haven't found the right style yet. Those statements sound similar, but emotionally, they are completely different. One closes the door, the other leaves it open. That became another rule I lived by. Never turn a temporary problem into a permanent identity. One bad outfit doesn't mean you can't dress well. One awkward outing doesn't mean you don't belong outside. One rude person doesn't mean everyone hates you. One embarrassing moment doesn't define your entire journey. Keep things in perspective. I wish someone had told me that when I started, because my early mistakes felt enormous. Now I can laugh at them. The first wig, the wrong shoes, the makeup that was far too heavy, the outfit that looked completely different under normal lighting, the time I spent 20 minutes trying to figure out why a skirt was sitting strangely, only to realize I had put it on backward. I laugh about those memories now. They weren't failures. They were lessons. And learning can be messy. Eventually, I became more comfortable helping others avoid the mistakes I had made. One friend wanted to know how to choose an outfit for a first public appearance. I told them to ignore trends. Choose something you could wear for 3 hours without thinking about it. They asked, what about looking feminine? That's secondary. They looked confused. I explained, if you're uncomfortable, you'll look uncomfortable. If you're comfortable, you'll naturally carry yourself better. That advice came directly from experience. The best outfit isn't necessarily the most feminine. It's the one that allows you to forget you're wearing it. That might be a dress. It might be a skirt. It might be jeans. It might be a blouse. It might be a sweater. There are no mandatory items. The same applies to makeup. If makeup makes you feel good, learn it. If it doesn't, don't force yourself. If you want a wig, experiment. If you prefer your natural hair, that's fine too. Crossdressing isn't a checklist. There isn't a minimum number of feminine elements required. You decide what expression means to you. That realization helped me stop comparing myself to other people. I started following creators whose stories inspired me. But I stopped using their appearance as a measuring stick for myself. Instead, I paid attention to their confidence, their creativity, their willingness to experiment, their ability to laugh at mistakes. That was much more useful, because appearance changes, confidence transfers, and kindness transfers. I wanted to become someone who could make another nervous person feel less alone. Maybe that was the biggest unexpected result of my journey. I started with fear. I ended with empathy. I understood what it felt like to hide. So when someone else looked nervous, I noticed. When someone was struggling with an outfit, I understood. When someone apologized for being curious, I told them it was okay. When someone felt embarrassed, I reminded them that being a beginner was normal. That is how experiences become valuable. Not when you keep them only for yourself. When you turn what you learned into something that can help someone else. One evening, I received a message from someone I barely knew. They said they had watched some of my earlier posts about confidence and cross-dressing. They told me they had been afraid to leave their house dressed differently. Then they said something that stayed with me. I finally went outside for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That was all. But they described it like they had climbed a mountain. I understood. Because I remembered my own first 10 minutes. The first walk. The first elevator. The first entrance. The first time someone looked. 10 minutes can be enormous when fear has controlled you for years. I replied with one sentence. You did it. Nothing more was necessary. They had already done the hard part, and that reminded me why small steps matter. People often want dramatic transformations. Before and after. Complete makeover. Instant confidence. But real growth is rarely dramatic. It's repetitive. It's ordinary. It's 10 minutes today. 15 minutes next week. A coffee after that. Then a dinner. Then a party. Then one day you realize you're not counting minutes anymore. You're just living. That's what happened to me. Eventually, I stopped measuring my progress by how long I could stay outside. I measured it by how much I enjoyed being there. That was a much better measurement. I also learned that confidence doesn't mean you never have bad days. Even now, there are moments when I look in the mirror and don't like what I see. There are outfits that don't work. There are days when I feel self-conscious. There are moments when a stranger looks at me and my old anxiety returns. But now I know what to do.
Breathe.
Observe. Don't assume. Check the situation. Choose what happens next. That ability is worth more than pretending fear doesn't exist. And then there was the question of what comes next. After so much growth, where do you go? The answer surprised me. You don't necessarily need to go anywhere. You can simply enjoy where you are. There is no final level. No trophy. No moment where someone announces that you've finally become confident enough. Life isn't a game with a finish line. You keep learning. Your style changes. Your comfort changes. Your interests change. Your circumstances change. And you adapt. That's normal. So I stopped looking for the final version of myself. I stopped asking what I would be like 5 years from now. I focused on today. What do I like today? What makes me comfortable today? What feels authentic today? That's enough. And maybe tomorrow the answer will change. That's okay. The person you become doesn't have to match the person you imagined. Sometimes the unexpected version of yourself is the most interesting one. Looking back, I realized that the title of this entire story was more literal than I understood. Walking into the party really was the hardest part. Not because the party was dangerous. Because walking through that door forced me to confront everything I believed about myself. I believed people were watching. I believed I needed to look perfect. I believed being noticed would be humiliating. I believed one awkward moment could destroy my confidence. I believed I needed permission. Most of those beliefs were wrong. And the only way I discovered that was by walking through the door. That's why sometimes action teaches you what thinking cannot. You can think about something for months. You can analyze every possibility. You can imagine every reaction. But eventually, you need real experience. Not reckless experience. Not unsafe experience. Real, thoughtful, prepared experience. That's where learning happens. The first time I walked through that door, I thought I was taking a risk with my appearance. I was actually taking a risk with my assumptions. And I discovered that my assumptions had been much scarier than reality. That lesson followed me into other parts of life. I became more willing to try new things. More willing to admit uncertainty. More willing to accept that not everyone would understand me. More willing to choose my own path. Cross-dressing didn't magically give me confidence. The process of confronting fear did. The clothes simply gave me a reason to confront it. That distinction is important. You don't have to dress differently to become confident. You can find confidence through anything that challenges you in a healthy way. For me, this happened to involve clothing and self-expression. For someone else, it might be public speaking, travel, meeting new people, starting a business, trying a new hobby. The pattern is the same. Fear says, don't go. Preparation says, here's how we'll handle it. Experience says, you survived. Then confidence grows. That's the cycle.
Fear.
Preparation.
Action.
Experience. Confidence. Then another challenge. And again. That's how we grow. So if you're beginning your own journey, don't wait until you're completely confident. You may never feel completely ready. Instead, prepare enough to feel reasonably safe. Then take a small step. If it goes well, learn from it. If it doesn't, learn from that too. Either way, you gain something. Experience. And experience is what turns fear into knowledge. I think that's why the memory of that first party still matters so much to me. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a movie. It was messy. I was terrified. I nearly turned around. And then I walked in. That single decision created hundreds of experiences afterward. New clothes. New friends. New conversations. New places. New confidence. New questions. New answers. All because I opened one door. Sometimes life changes through enormous decisions. Sometimes it changes through tiny ones. That night, mine was tiny. Open the door. Step inside. Stay for 5 minutes. Then another 5. Then another. Until suddenly, the fear wasn't in charge anymore. And if you're watching this right now, maybe you're standing in front of a door too. Maybe nobody else knows. Maybe you've never told anyone. Maybe you've only tried things privately. Maybe you're wondering whether you're ready. Don't compare your journey to mine. Your door may be different. Your timeline may be different. Your reasons may be different. Your comfort level may be different. That's okay. There is no race. There is no requirement to go public. There is no requirement to change your identity. There is no requirement to explain yourself. You get to decide what the next step means. And if you decide to take that step, do it thoughtfully. Choose a safe environment. Tell someone you trust if appropriate. Have transportation. Keep your phone available. Wear clothes you can move in. Don't rely on uncomfortable shoes just because they look good. Don't carry more than you need. And don't allow someone else's pressure to push you beyond your boundaries. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to change your mind. Those aren't failures. Those are choices. And choices are what makes self-expression meaningful. Without choice, it becomes performance. With choice, it becomes freedom. That's what I finally found. Not a perfect appearance. Not universal approval. Freedom. The freedom to decide. The freedom to experiment. The freedom to be private. The freedom to be visible. The freedom to change. And the freedom to say, this is something I enjoy, without feeling like I needed to defend the sentence. That freedom was worth every nervous step. And when I think about the person I was before that first party, I don't feel embarrassed anymore. I feel compassion. That person was scared. They didn't have the answers. They didn't know what would happen.
They were trying to protect themselves.
They deserved patience. They deserved kindness. And so did I. Maybe that's the final lesson. Be kind to the person you are while you're becoming the person you're meant to be. Don't bully yourself into confidence. Don't insult yourself into improvement. Don't compare yourself into happiness. Learn.
Practice.
Explore. Adjust. And keep moving. One step at a time. Because sometimes the biggest transformation isn't visible in photographs. It happens quietly. Inside your thoughts. One day you realize you no longer hate the part of yourself you used to hide.
You don't need to announce it.
You don't need to explain it. You simply know. And that knowledge makes you lighter.
That's what happened to me.
The party was only the beginning. The real journey was everything that happened afterward. The clothing taught me experimentation. The makeup taught me patience. The awkward moments taught me humility. The strangers taught me not to assume. The friends taught me acceptance. The difficult moments taught me boundaries. And the first door taught me courage. I still remember it. My hand on the handle. My heart racing. The music on the other side. The voice in my head saying, turn around. And another voice, quieter but stronger, saying, just open it. I listened to the second voice. And I'm glad I did. Because sometimes that tiny voice is the one telling you that you're ready to discover something new. Not everything new will be wonderful. Not every experiment will work. Not every person will understand, but you won't know until you take the next safe step. So when the moment comes, don't ask yourself whether you can guarantee everything will go perfectly. You can't. Ask yourself whether you've prepared enough to take the next step safely. If yes, take it. If no, prepare more. There is no shame in waiting. There is no shame in moving slowly. And there is no shame in being nervous. The only thing I regret is how many years I spent believing fear was the same thing as truth. It wasn't. Fear was a feeling. Reality was something I had to experience. Once I experienced it, I could finally separate the two. And that changed everything. The door didn't become less frightening. I simply became willing to open it. And sometimes that's all courage is. Not knowing what is on the other side. Opening the door anyway. Walking forward anyway. And discovering, step by step, that you were capable of much more than you thought. That was the hardest part, walking in. Everything after that taught me how to stay. But there was one thing I had never done. I had learned how to walk into parties. I had learned how to shop. I had learned how to sit in cafes. I had learned how to meet strangers. I had learned how to handle questions. I had learned how to dress comfortably. I had learned how to stop chasing perfection. But I had never looked back at the entire journey and asked myself the simplest question. What had I actually been afraid of losing? The answer came to me one quiet evening while I was cleaning my room. I found the clothes for my first party.
The blouse.
The skirt. The little necklace. The shoes. I hadn't worn some of them in months. I picked up the blouse and smiled. It wasn't particularly beautiful. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even my favorite style anymore. But holding it brought back the entire night.
The car.
The hallway. The elevator. The music.
The door.
My shaking hand. Daniel's smile. The first compliment. The first photograph. The moment I realized nobody was watching me nearly as much as I imagined. And then I realized what I had actually been afraid of. I wasn't afraid of the dress. I wasn't even really afraid of people. I was afraid that if people saw me expressing myself differently, they would decide that the person they knew had disappeared. I was afraid they would look at me and think I had become someone else. But that fear had been based on a misunderstanding. I hadn't disappeared. I had become more honest. And that was the final piece of the puzzle. For years, I thought authenticity meant choosing one version of myself and sticking with it. I thought I had to decide whether I was one thing or another. But people aren't that simple. We change depending on the day. We have different moods, different interests, different sides. Sometimes we're confident. Sometimes we're nervous. Sometimes we're serious. Sometimes we're playful. Sometimes we want to stand out. Sometimes we want to disappear into the crowd. None of those versions are fake. They're all part of us. Crossdressing taught me that lesson in a very unexpected way. I had been trying so hard to answer the question, who am I? Eventually, I realized I could ask a better question. Who am I allowed to become? The answer was nobody else's decision. That didn't mean I could ignore reality. It didn't mean every environment was safe. It didn't mean everyone had to understand. It meant I could explore myself without treating curiosity like a crime. That was freedom. And once I understood that, I stopped needing every experience to prove something. I didn't need the perfect photograph. I didn't need strangers to compliment me. I didn't need someone to tell me I looked convincing. I didn't need to hear that I looked beautiful. Of course, compliments felt good, but they weren't the foundation anymore. The foundation was internal. I could put on an outfit and simply think, I like this. That was enough. I could take it off later. I could change my mind. I could try something different tomorrow. Nothing had to be permanent. That realization removed an enormous amount of pressure. I started experimenting more freely. Sometimes I would create an outfit that looked elegant. Sometimes casual. Sometimes playful. Sometimes completely different from anything I had worn before. And I stopped judging the experiments based on whether someone else would approve. I judged them based on one question. Does this feel like me? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was absolutely not. Both answers were useful, because every failed experiment taught me something. One outfit taught me that I hated stiff fabric. Another taught me that I preferred softer colors. One pair of shoes taught me that looking good wasn't worth being uncomfortable. Another taught me that a simple accessory could completely change an outfit. One hairstyle made me feel older than I wanted. Another made me feel confident immediately. None of these discoveries happened because I had a perfect plan. They happened because I tried. That is something I would tell anyone beginning this journey. You don't have to know your style before you experiment. Experimentation is how you discover your style. You don't have to know what makes you confident. Trying things teaches you. You don't have to know exactly what cross-dressing means to you. Experience can help you understand that too. Give yourself room. That room is important. Because sometimes people become frightened when their feelings don't fit the explanation they expected. Maybe they enjoy feminine clothes but don't want to change anything else. Maybe they enjoy a complete transformation, but only occasionally. Maybe they feel more comfortable expressing femininity than they expected. Maybe they discover feelings about identity they hadn't considered. Maybe they discover that they simply love fashion. There is no requirement to immediately reach a conclusion. Self-discovery is allowed to be unfinished. I wish someone had told me that earlier. I thought every feeling required an immediate answer. It doesn't. Sometimes you can simply notice something. I enjoyed that. I didn't enjoy that. I want to try this again. I don't want to do that again. Those simple observations can tell you more than hours of overthinking. And slowly, the noise in my head became quieter. The constant questions disappeared. What if someone finds out? What if someone laughs? What if someone doesn't understand? What if I don't look feminine enough? What if I regret it? They didn't disappear because I found perfect answers. They disappeared because I stopped giving them control over every decision. That was the difference. Fear could still speak. I just didn't have to obey it. One evening, I decided to do something I had never imagined doing during the first months of my journey. I hosted a small gathering. At my own home. I invited a few trusted friends. I chose the outfit I wanted. I prepared food. I arranged the room. I played music. And then I waited for everyone to arrive. I remember standing near the entrance and suddenly laughing. The same person who had once been terrified of entering someone else's party was now standing at home, waiting to welcome people. I opened the door when the first guest arrived. Hey. Hey. Come in. 3 simple words.
Come in.
I didn't realize how meaningful they were until that moment. I had spent so long thinking about what it meant to walk into someone else's space. Now, I was creating a space where someone else could walk in, and I wanted it to feel safe. That became another part of my journey. I didn't just want acceptance for myself. I wanted to create the kind of environment I had needed when I was afraid. Nobody was required to explain themselves. Nobody was pressured to dress a certain way. Nobody had to perform. We simply ate,
Talked. Laughed.
shared stories. And at one point, someone said something that made everyone laugh. I looked around the room, and I thought about the first party, how terrified I had been, how impossible this would have seemed. And suddenly, I felt emotional. Not because I was sad,
Because I realized how much had changed.
The biggest transformation wasn't visible. It was the fact that I no longer felt like I was waiting for permission. I was creating my own environment. I was deciding who I trusted. I was choosing what I wore. I was choosing when I wanted to be visible. And I was choosing when I wanted privacy. That is what control looks like. Not controlling other people's reactions. Controlling your own decisions. The party ended late. Everyone left. I closed the door. The apartment became quiet. I cleaned the table, put away the glasses, turned off the music. Then I stood in the middle of the room. For a few seconds, I simply listened to the silence. And I remembered the first night. I remembered how desperately I had wanted to disappear. Now I was standing in an empty room wishing the night had lasted longer. I smiled. Then I realized something. Maybe the goal had never been to become fearless. Maybe the goal was to build a life where fear didn't make every decision. That was a much more realistic goal. And a much more powerful one. Because fear is part of being human. Everyone experiences it. The difference is what we do with it. Some fears protect us. Others limit us. Learning to tell the difference is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. If a place feels genuinely unsafe, leave. If someone is threatening you, get away and seek help. If your instincts tell you something is wrong, listen. But if the only thing stopping you is the imaginary possibility that somebody might think you're strange, pause. Ask yourself whether you're sacrificing an experience for an opinion that may never even happen. That question saved me countless times. Sometimes the answer was still, I'm not ready. And that was okay. Not being ready is different from being incapable. I learned to respect the difference. There were events I skipped, outfits I didn't wear, places I decided weren't right. That wasn't failure. That was judgment. You don't need to prove your courage by putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. You prove courage by making thoughtful choices even when emotion is pushing you in another direction. Sometimes courage means walking in. Sometimes courage means walking away. Knowing the difference is maturity. And that was something I had gained through experience. I also learned that confidence doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes confidence is incredibly quiet. It looks like choosing your outfit without asking 10 people for approval. It looks like looking in the mirror and not insulting yourself. It looks like politely declining a question. It looks like saying, I don't want to talk about that. It looks like leaving when you're uncomfortable. It looks like staying when you're comfortable. It looks like laughing at an imperfect photograph. It looks like trying again after a bad experience. And sometimes it looks exactly like what happened to me. A hand on a door. A deep breath. One step. That's all. One of the strangest things about growth is that you rarely notice it while it's happening. You notice afterward. You look back and realize that something that once terrified you has become ordinary. That happened to me repeatedly. The first time I went shopping. The first time I wore makeup outside. The first time someone recognized me. The first time I went somewhere alone. The first time I took a photograph without immediately deleting it. The first time I answered a personal question calmly. The first time I told someone, yes, I enjoy this. Each moment seemed huge at the time. Later, they became memories. That's how progress works. The mountain looks enormous when you're standing at the bottom. After you've climbed it, you can see the individual steps. And then you realize there were more steps than you thought. That's why I stopped expecting one giant transformation. I started celebrating small victories. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. One conversation. One outfit. One photograph. One trip. One party. One door. Small victories compound. And eventually, they create a completely different life. That is why I believe the first step matters so much. Not because the first step is the most impressive. Because the first step creates the possibility of every step after it. If I had stayed in that car outside the first party, I wouldn't have learned everything that came afterward. I wouldn't have discovered the styles I liked. I wouldn't have met people who supported me. I wouldn't have learned how to handle awkward conversations. I wouldn't have understood the difference between privacy and shame. I wouldn't have become comfortable helping others. None of that would have happened. All of it began with one decision. Open the door. And maybe that's why I remember the sound of the door opening so clearly. It was just a small click. The handle turned. The door moved. Music came through. And I stepped inside. No fireworks. No dramatic announcement. No perfect transformation. Just a normal door. And yet, in my memory, it became enormous. Because sometimes ordinary objects become symbols for extraordinary moments.
A door.
A mirror. A pair of shoes. A photograph. A piece of clothing. They can all carry memories. That blouse wasn't just fabric anymore. It represented courage. Those shoes weren't just shoes. They represented the first time I walked somewhere I had been afraid to enter. That necklace wasn't just an accessory. It reminded me that I could choose how I presented myself. And that photograph wasn't just a picture. It was proof that I had stopped hiding for one night. Years later, I still have that photograph. I don't keep it because I think I looked perfect. I keep it because I remember how I felt. Nervous. Excited.
Terrified. Alive.
That combination is difficult to forget. And sometimes I look at it and think about how badly I wanted to turn around. I'm glad I didn't. Not because everyone should do the same thing, but because that particular decision was right for me. That's the part people sometimes miss. Your journey belongs to you. Someone else's confidence doesn't mean you should move faster. Someone else's style doesn't mean you should copy it. Someone else's experience doesn't determine yours. Learn from other people, but don't live their journey. Build your own. If you're a beginner, maybe your first step is private. That's fine. If you've been doing this for years, maybe your next step is simply trying a new style. That's fine too. If you're comfortable going out, you may want to help someone else feel less nervous. That's beautiful. If you prefer keeping everything private, that's valid. There is no hierarchy. Public doesn't mean more authentic. Private doesn't mean less authentic. The only thing that matters is whether your choices are genuinely yours, and whether they respect your safety and the people around you. That became my definition of healthy self-expression.
Choice.
Consent. Comfort. Boundaries. Safety.
Honesty.
Everything else is personal preference. And once I understood that, I stopped searching for rules. I started searching for what worked. That made the journey much more enjoyable. I could focus on fashion. I could enjoy colors. I could experiment with textures. I could learn makeup. I could try different hairstyles. I could enjoy the process instead of worrying about what everything meant. And sometimes I would simply wear something because I thought it looked nice. No deeper explanation. No dramatic transformation. Just fashion. That simplicity was liberating. One day, while browsing clothes, I saw another outfit that immediately caught my attention. I picked it up. Then I paused. I remembered the old version of myself who would have immediately asked, "What will people think?" I smiled. Then I asked a different question. "Do I like it?" Yes. I bought it. That was it. No anxiety. No debate. No imaginary courtroom inside my head. Just a purchase. A normal choice. And I realized that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The thing that once required enormous courage had become ordinary. That is what success looked like. Not a dramatic before and after. Normal. Peaceful.
Mine.
I think that's what many people are actually searching for when they talk about confidence. Not applause. Not attention.
Peace.
The ability to exist without constantly fighting yourself. The ability to enjoy something without immediately asking whether you're allowed to enjoy it. The ability to make a choice and trust yourself afterward. That's what I found. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened through hundreds of tiny moments. A mirror. A blouse. A party. A cafe. A shopping trip. A conversation. A photograph. A friend. A mistake. A second attempt. Another door. Another step. And another. So if you're watching this and you're still standing at the beginning, don't feel behind. You aren't behind. There is no schedule. You don't have to catch up to anyone. Your journey can take months, years, a lifetime. That's okay. Take the time you need. Learn what makes you comfortable. Learn what makes you uncomfortable. Learn your boundaries. Learn your style. Learn who you can trust. And most importantly, learn how to listen to yourself without automatically believing. Every fear. Fear is loud. Your real voice may be quieter. Listen carefully. Sometimes the quiet voice says, "Wait." Sometimes it says, "Leave." Sometimes it says, "Try." And sometimes, like it did for me, it simply says, "Open the door."
I did.
And that one decision gave me a life I never expected. Not because I became someone else. Because I stopped being afraid of the person I already was. That's the final lesson I want to leave with you. You don't need to transform yourself into someone else's idea of perfection. You don't need to erase every masculine feature. You don't need to perform femininity perfectly. You don't need to look like a celebrity. You don't need expensive clothes. You don't need complicated makeup. You don't need approval from strangers. You need curiosity, patience, self-respect, and enough courage to take the next safe step. Maybe you'll discover that cross-dressing is simply something you enjoy. Maybe you'll discover that it connects to something deeper. Maybe you'll decide it isn't for you. Whatever you discover, let the discovery be honest. Don't force an answer because you think you're supposed to have one. And don't reject an answer because you're afraid of what it might mean. Give yourself time. You deserve that. I think back to the first party sometimes. I remember standing outside. I remember looking at the door. I remember thinking, if I open this, everything will change. I was right. Everything changed. Just not in the way I expected. The world didn't change. The people didn't change. The building didn't change. The music didn't change. I changed. I became a little more willing to trust myself. A little more willing to be visible. A little less willing to let fear make my decisions. And those tiny changes eventually became a completely different relationship with myself. That is what transformation really was. Not becoming somebody else. Becoming less afraid of being me. And now, whenever I approach a new situation, I remember that door. Not as something I conquered, as something that taught me. The lesson is simple. You don't have to feel ready. You don't have to feel fearless. You don't have to know exactly what happens next. You just need to know whether the next step is safe enough to take. If it is, take it.
If it isn't, wait. Prepare.
Try again later. There is no shame in either choice. Because the goal isn't to prove how brave you are. The goal is to live honestly while taking care of yourself. That is what I finally understood. And maybe that's why walking into the party was the hardest part. Once I crossed that threshold, I discovered something I had been searching for all along. Not attention. Not approval. Not perfection. Permission. But not permission from the crowd. Permission from myself. Permission to explore. Permission to experiment. Permission to enjoy fashion. Permission to be nervous. Permission to change. Permission to be private. Permission to be visible. Permission to say no. Permission to walk away. And permission to walk back in when I was ready. Nobody else could give me that. I had to give it to myself. And once I did, the door opened. The music came through. I took one step, then another. And for the first time, I wasn't walking toward someone else's idea of who I should be. I was walking toward myself. That was the real party. That was the real transformation. And that was the moment I finally understood that sometimes the hardest part of becoming comfortable with yourself isn't changing anything about who you are. It's simply having the courage to stop hiding. So if one day you find yourself standing in front of a door, heart racing, wondering whether you're ready, remember my story. Don't promise yourself that nothing will go wrong. Don't promise yourself that everyone will understand. Don't promise yourself that you'll look perfect. Make a different promise. Promise yourself that you'll stay safe. Promise yourself that you'll respect your boundaries. Promise yourself that you won't let one person's opinion define you. Promise yourself that you'll listen to your instincts. And if the moment feels right, take that breath. Reach for the handle. Open the door. Step inside. You might still be nervous. That's okay. You might still feel your heart racing. That's okay. You might still wonder what people are thinking. That's okay. Walk anyway. Because courage isn't the moment fear disappears. Courage is the moment you realize fear doesn't get to make the decision anymore. And when you finally take that step, don't look around searching for approval. Look around and experience the moment. Listen to the music. Notice the lights. Enjoy the conversation.
Laugh.
Smile. Be present. Because one day, years from now, you may look back at that moment and realize something incredible. The thing you were most afraid of became one of the memories you're most grateful for. That happened to me. And every time I remember that first party, I don't remember the fear first. I remember the door opening. I remember the music. I remember stepping inside. And I remember thinking almost in disbelief, I actually did it. That sentence still makes me smile. Because sometimes that's all you need. Not a perfect transformation. Not a perfect night. Just one moment when you realize you did something you once believed you couldn't. And that moment can become the beginning of everything. The beginning of confidence. The beginning of self-acceptance. The beginning of a new style. The beginning of new friendships. The beginning of honest conversations. The beginning of helping someone else. The beginning of a life where fear is still present, but no longer in control. For me, it all started with a party.
And a door.
And a trembling hand. And a decision. I opened it. I walked in. And I finally stopped running from myself. That is the story I will always remember. Not because the outfit was perfect. Not because everyone approved. Not because I suddenly became fearless. Because for one night, I chose courage over hiding. And sometimes one night is all it takes to prove to yourself that another life is possible. Not a different life. Your life. Just with a little more honesty, a little more freedom, and a lot less fear. So when your moment comes, remember this. The hardest part may only be the first step. Take it when you're ready.
Take it safely.
Take it on your own terms. And once you do, don't spend the whole journey wondering whether you belong. You walk through the door. You made the choice. You are there. Now, let yourself live the moment. Because the person you were so afraid to show might be the person who finally teaches you how to stop hiding. And sometimes, the most important transformation doesn't happen when you change your clothes. It happens when you change the way you see yourself. That was the transformation I was looking for all along. And it began the moment I opened the door.